Something is happening in laboratories around the world that would have seemed absurd 20 years ago. Scientists are running clinical trials on honey, serious ones, published in peer-reviewed journals, funded by major research institutions, measuring honey against pharmaceutical antibiotics, and coming back with results that are difficult to explain away. Researchers are studying fermented foods and finding that the microbial cultures our ancestors relied on for preservation are doing something to the human gut that no modern supplement has yet replicated. They are analyzing tubers eaten by hunter-gatherers and discovering fiber structures that feed gut bacteria in ways that processed food has systematically destroyed. They are, in other words, catching up to knowledge that was not lost because it was wrong. It was lost because it was inconvenient, because it couldn't be patented, packaged, or scaled into an industry. Your ancestors knew things about food that took the modern world centuries of forgetting to begin remembering. This is what they knew. To understand why ancient food knowledge was so sophisticated, you need to understand the conditions that produced it. For the vast majority of human history, food was not simply fuel, it was medicine, currency, social bond, and survival technology simultaneously. A plant that reduced inflammation meant the difference between recovering from injury and dying from it. A fermented food that prevented gut illness during winter kept the group functional when vulnerability could be fatal. Knowledge about which foods restored energy after sustained physical stress, which reduced fever, which accelerated healing, that knowledge was as critical as any hunting or navigation skill. It was tested relentlessly, across hundreds of generations, in conditions where getting it wrong had immediate and serious consequences. What survived that testing was not folklore. It was empirical knowledge, accumulated through a process far longer and more rigorous than any modern clinical trial. The trial lasted 300,000 years. The sample size was the entire human species. What modern science is now discovering, compound by compound, is that the knowledge embedded in ancient food traditions was not superstition dressed up as wisdom. It was wisdom that didn't yet have the language of biochemistry to explain itself. Start with honey, because the story of honey and the human relationship with bees reaches further back than almost any other food connection we can trace. Rock paintings in Spain dating to 8,000 years ago show humans climbing rope ladders to reach wild beehives, smoke in one hand, the other reaching into the comb. But this was not the beginning. Researchers studying ancient human remains and archaeological sites have found evidence of sustained honey consumption stretching back at least 40,000 years. Some researchers place the human relationship with bees considerably earlier, deep into our hunter-gatherer past, when honey represented one of the most calorie-dense foods available in nature. The Hadza, who we explored in our last episode, still hunt honey today with the help of the honey guide bird, a co-evolutionary relationship so ancient and so specific that it suggests the Hadza and their ancestors have been following that bird to hives for tens of thousands of years. When a Hadza honey hunter finds a hive, he leaves a portion of comb for the bird. The bird leads him to the next one. It is a partnership older than any human institution. But honey was never just calories, and ancient peoples knew it. Egyptian medical papyri, dating back 3,500 years, describe honey being applied to wounds to prevent infection and accelerate healing. Ayurvedic texts from ancient India reference honey as both food and medicine across dozens of applications. Greek physicians, including Hippocrates, the figure credited as the father of modern medicine, prescribed honey for wound care, digestive complaints, and fever. For millennia, this was dismissed by modern medicine as pre-scientific superstition. Then researchers began looking at what honey actually contains. What they found reframed the conversation entirely. Honey is not simply sugar. It is a biochemically complex substance containing over 200 identified compounds, enzymes, organic acids, flavonoids, polyphenols, and a remarkable molecule called hydrogen peroxide, produced enzymatically when honey contacts moisture. That hydrogen peroxide is one of the mechanisms behind honey's antibacterial properties, but it is not the only one. Honey is hygroscopic. It draws moisture out of bacterial cells, disrupting their ability to survive. Its pH, typically between 3.2 and 4.5, creates an acidic environment hostile to most pathogens. The polyphenol compounds it contains have demonstrated anti-inflammatory properties in multiple studies. Some varieties, particularly Manuka honey from New Zealand, contain additional antimicrobial compounds, notably methylglyoxal at concentrations that have shown clinical effectiveness against bacteria, including antibiotic-resistant strains. A systematic review published in a major medical journal found honey more effective than standard care for upper respiratory tract infections in children. Clinical trials have found it comparable to some over-the-counter wound care treatments. Research into its prebiotic properties, the way certain honey compounds selectively feed beneficial gut bacteria, is ongoing and producing results that are, by the standards of the field, remarkable. Your ancestors who reached into smoking beehives at altitude, who maintained relationships with bees across generations, who kept honey as one of the most valued substances in their material world, they were not being primitive, they were being precise. The importance of bees extends beyond honey, and ancient peoples understood this too, even without the vocabulary of pollination ecology. Cultures across the ancient world maintained complex relationships with bees. In ancient Egypt, the bee was a royal symbol, appearing in pharaonic titles and temple carvings. Bee imagery appears in Minoan art, in ancient Greek religious contexts, in pre-Columbian Mesoamerican civilizations. The Maya kept stingless bees, a different species from the European honeybee, in carefully constructed log hives, harvesting both honey and wax for ceremonial and medicinal use. This reverence was not arbitrary. It reflected an intuitive understanding, built through careful observation across generations, that where bees thrived, the land flourished. That the health of the bee population and the health of the food supply were not separate things. That to protect the bee was to protect the harvest. Modern science has given us the mechanism, the extraordinary role of bees as pollinators, responsible for the reproduction of roughly 1/3 of the food crops humans consume globally. But the observation that preceded that mechanism by thousands of years was sound. Ancient peoples could not have explained pollination in biological terms. They could observe that where bees disappeared, abundance followed them out. That observational intelligence, accumulated slowly, tested constantly, encoded in reverence and ritual, was itself a form of ecological knowledge that modern agriculture spent the 20th century dismantling and is now urgently trying to reconstruct. Beyond honey, the ancient food knowledge that modern science is revalidating runs deep. Fermentation is perhaps the most striking example. Across every major ancient culture on Earth, without exception, fermented foods were central to the diet. Fermented grains in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, fermented fish across Scandinavia and East Asia, fermented vegetables, forms of what we would now recognize as kimchi and sauerkraut, across Korea, Germany, and Eastern Europe. Fermented dairy across the pastoral cultures of Central Asia and the Middle East. The reasons given for these practices were various: preservation, flavor, religious significance. But the effect which ancient peoples observed without being able to explain was that fermented foods kept people healthier. Communities that consumed them regularly showed lower rates of digestive illness. People who ate them through winter arrived at spring in better condition than those who did not. What modern science has now established is why. Fermentation produces live microbial cultures, what we now call probiotics, that colonize the gut and perform functions critical to immune regulation, nutrient absorption, and the production of neurotransmitters including serotonin. The gut microbiome, which fermented foods directly support, is now understood to be so central to overall health that some researchers refer to it as a second brain. The ancient world didn't know about the microbiome, but they knew that the foods which supported it kept them alive and functional in conditions that would have otherwise been devastating. Tubers, roots, and wild plants complete the picture. The ancestral diet, particularly in hunter-gatherer populations like the Hadza, was extraordinarily high in dietary fiber. Not the processed fiber added back into modern foods after manufacturing strips it out, but complex, varied, naturally occurring fiber structures from dozens of different plant sources consumed in rotation across seasons. Modern research into fiber has reached a point of near consensus. The diversity of fiber in the diet directly determines the diversity of the gut microbiome, which determines the breadth of microbial functions available to the body. The average person in an industrialized nation consumes somewhere between 15 and 20 grams of fiber per day. Estimates of ancestral fiber intake run between 100 and 150 grams per day from sources of vastly greater variety. The diseases most closely associated with low fiber intake, colorectal cancer, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, inflammatory bowel conditions, were effectively absent from populations eating the ancestral diet. They are the defining diseases of modernity. The ancient world was not eating well by accident. It was eating well because the food itself had not yet been separated from the intelligence that selected it over hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary pressure. Modern science is not discovering new things. It is rediscovering old ones slowly, with expensive equipment, in conditions far more controlled, but far less honest than the ones that produced the original knowledge. The people who kept bees in log hives, who fermented vegetables through winter, who dug tubers from cracked earth, and knew exactly which roots restored strength after illness, they were doing something that deserves more than the word primitive. They were practicing a medicine older than medicine, a nutrition science older than science. And it worked. If these stories are landing for you, the real history of what humans knew and how they lived, subscribe and stay with us. There is a great deal more ground to cover. Your ancestors didn't survive by accident, neither will you.